This is the second in a video series called Win the Walkthrough, in which we look at walkthrough questions in much more detail. Today we are looking at the first three questions on the walkthrough document that entail the learning outcome, the assessment criteria or success criteria, as well as what activity students are doing and whether or not that activity aligns with the learning outcome. So the first three questions on the walkthrough document really entail teacher clarity, and teacher clarity is very important to whether or not student learning is going to occur in a classroom. To prove that point, we can look at John Hattie's research, and if you look about 5 down from the top, teacher clarity is ranked near the top at an effect size of 0.75. And if you don't know what that means, simply just go over to this hinge scale, and you can see that effect sizes of 0.4 and higher are considered medium to high, and teacher clarity is considered a high effect size. So when teachers are clear about what students are learning, why they're learning it, and how they're going to know that they've learned it, student learning is increased. So again, those three questions are: what am I learning today? Why am I learning this? And how will I know that I have learned it? These three questions are essential, really, for students to understand the content or skills that they're learning, why it's relevant, and how they know that they've acquired those skills or understand that content. And these, by the way, are the questions oftentimes that I'll ask students when I visit classrooms for walkthroughs, just to see if what you're saying as the teacher is resonating with the students. So what happens when clarity isn't evident in a lesson? Well, typically what happens is the lesson feels fragmented. It's more of an activity-driven lesson in that students are completing tasks rather than completely understanding why they're completing those tasks or what those tasks are leading to. Oftentimes it has misaligned strategies that don't work in concert, a lack of progress monitoring, so a lack of formative assessment, and really data that's produced from that lesson isn't very helpful because it's not tied directly to standards and directly to student learning. As you might guess, if it does have clarity, it's the opposite of all those things. So it's a cohesive lesson that is learning driven, that's aligned to standards, produces viable data so that teachers know what standards students have learned and what standards need to be readdressed. Next, let's look at the agenda. The agenda is simply just a clear list or description of what students will be doing to accomplish the learning target. The agenda should be in student-friendly language, so while it may have content-specific words in it, you just want to make sure that it's developmentally appropriate for your students so that they can look up, see it, and follow along as they go through the learning progression of the lesson to accomplish that learning target. The statement on the walkthrough document that implicitly connects to the agenda is one that looks at the activity that students are completing and whether or not that activity is aligned to an instructional outcome. So that activity should be somewhere in the agenda list. So just some examples of items that could be on an agenda list would be the first one there from social studies, the second one from mathematics, and the third one from English. Let's take a look at learning outcomes. And learning outcomes in the walkthrough instrument are called instructional outcomes or learning targets. I have a few of the other names that they're known by here on the screen, but don't get confused. They essentially mean the same thing. It's what students should be able to do or what students are learning for a given class period. So here are the characteristics of a learning target or instructional outcome. I've already talked about what students are doing. These are not standards, but they're aligned to standards. So a teacher shouldn't simply just take a standard and put it up on the whiteboard, because standards are written for practitioners, and it's written in such a way, with such language, that not all students can access it. So you want to make sure that you're using developmentally appropriate language, student-friendly language, when writing your learning target. Learning targets, just like the agenda and the assessment criteria, should be shared at the beginning of the lesson. So a teacher should go over what the agenda is. Here are the steps that you'll be going through in the lesson, and you're going through those steps to accomplish the learning target. And again, that should be shared at the beginning of the lesson, but it should also be reiterated throughout the instructional process or the lesson so that students are reminded what they're working toward. Keep in mind that learning targets are simply just a step in the learning progression. They don't even, in many cases, represent the totality of a standard. Oftentimes, it's a singular skill that's necessary to accomplish or to learn or to master a standard, but it's not a standard. So when you think about your instructional unit, those instructional units have a list of standards that you want students to master. A learning target would be one element toward learning or mastering a standard. Um, Learning targets should not reference specific content. So you shouldn't see the title of a book or a play or a short story in a learning target, because we want our students to see the learning as being paramount rather than the content. We need to make sure that we're explicit about separating the content from the learning. The content can be in the agenda, but it should not be with the learning target, because we want our students to see the skills and what they're learning as being transferable to other disciplines. Learning targets are great primers for learners, so it gets students aware and oftentimes excited or engaged with the learning process, and I'll go more about that here in a second. And they're aligned to assessment criteria. So your agenda, your learning target, and your assessment criteria should be aligned and working together. So again, another word about priming. If you go over your learning target and your agenda and your assessment criteria at the beginning of the lesson, what you're in essence doing is giving students an idea of the breadth, the scope, and the depth of that lesson. And that understanding oftentimes increases engagement. So students understanding what's going on in the lesson will know what they're working toward, which is relevance, as well as what they need to do to accomplish or what they need to accomplish in that agenda in order to access, learn, or be able to do whatever's in the learning target. It also helps them connect to prior knowledge. So if you're talking about a skill in a learning target rather than content in a learning target, students are more likely to connect that to prior knowledge and prior experiences, prior learning, so on and so forth, and it improves student efficacy. So students are much more confident in their ability to accomplish a goal if they understand the steps necessary to accomplish that goal and ultimately what that goal is. And then lastly, how they'll know that they reached that goal. And that's the assessment or success criteria. So here's the statement on the walkthrough document for instructional outcomes and learning targets. You'll notice that it's three options here. No outcome is posted or evidenced. Outcome posted or evidenced but not aligned to a standard, and outcome posted or evidenced and aligned to a standard. And I think it's important to note here that or evidence. So in some cases, a teacher will have his or her learning target and agenda on Canvas, and it's not going to be visible on a whiteboard, especially here at Douglas where we have teachers moving around. That's more likely. As long as students can articulate what they're learning and how they're acquiring that knowledge or acquiring that skill, then you can put that it's evidenced. That learning should be aligned to a standard, and it should be a grade level appropriate standard. In some cases, I'll walk into a classroom and I'll see that what they're doing is standards based, but it may be a standard that's not a grade level. So just make sure that what students are doing is grade level appropriate. Lastly, here is an example of how one would go from a standard to a learning target. So on the far left here, we have the actual standard written in a language for practitioners. Then we have the learning progression, where they are in the unit. And then lastly, the statement that I would deliver to a student. At the bottom here in the blue boxes, what we have are just different examples of what learning targets could look like in different subject areas. Next, let's look at assessment and success criteria. So assessment or success criteria are aligned with instructional outcomes, meaning you have your agenda that articulates what students are doing. You have your learning target that communicates what students should learn or what they should be able to do, and your assessment or success criteria, which communicates how you and how students can check for that learning. Your assessment criteria should communicate the characteristics of high quality work. It should convey high expectations, and you do that through criteria, lists, rubric, exemplars. Again, it should be a check for understanding. Students should be able to reference it to see where they are in reference to accessing or mastering that skill or acquiring that learning. It should be used by the teacher to provide feedback. So if I'm working with a student in an activity that's on my agenda and they know they're working toward that learning target, I should be able to reference my assessment criteria in order to give students feedback on where they are in the acquisition of that skill or in the process of that learning. It should also encourage student self-assessment. So students, again, being able to reference that assessment criteria, should be able to look up, see what the exemplar is or what the rubric is in order to look at what they're currently working on in that agenda to see where they are in relation to mastering that learning outcome. And then lastly, you could, and it's encouraged, to establish these assessment criteria with students, because research suggests that students who have a hand in creating the rubric or the criteria for an assessment are more likely to work hard to try to achieve those goals. A question you can ask as you are developing your assessment criteria is, do students know exactly what must be done to demonstrate achievement and mastery of the assigned task or the instructional outcome? So here is an example of a 10th grade English assessment criteria, and you can see the standard on the far left, the instructional outcome or learning target in the middle, and the success or assessment criteria on the right. And so notice the standard starts with the practitioner language of a standard. We've simplified that language in the instructional outcome. We've also taken just a part of that standard out for the instructional outcome, because that standard would probably take more than one lesson to master, of course. And then from that instructional outcome, I have multiple I can statements that articulate what students should be able to do in order to demonstrate that they know how to identify specific evidence in the text to support a claim. Now that we've talked about what success and assessment criteria are, let's look at a few non-examples. Completing a worksheet, finishing an assignment, making a poster, and completing a presentation may be tasks or activities that students do to demonstrate learning, but they in and of themselves are not assessment criteria, meaning that a student couldn't look at the board and read complete a worksheet in order to gauge whether or not he or she has acquired that skill or has mastered that content. Notice the last one here has an asterisk beside it because currently Fayette County Public Schools is using the term assessment criteria, and the word assessment for many implies a quantitative measure. So, as long as Fayette County uses the term assessment criteria instead of success criteria, the examples on the right should be okay. I can rephrase important details in my own words to 80% mastery, or I can expand expressions using the quotient property of exponents to 80% mastery, have the language of success criteria, but just marry it with the quantitative measures. So again, students still are able to look at the I can statement to know what they should be learning or how they know that they've acquired that learning, and then the quantitative measure gives them another element to gauging whether or not they've mastered that skill or acquired that learning. Last, let's look at the statement in the walkthrough instrument that is used to give you feedback on your assessment criteria. You'll notice that there are three different options here. One that says not posted or evidence, so it's not on the wall, on the whiteboard, and when I talk to students, they can't articulate what they're learning or how they're being assessed. The second is posted or evidence but needs improvement, so it might be written up there on the whiteboard, or maybe students understand it, but it's not grade level, or it doesn't align with the learning target, or doesn't seem to align with the agenda or what students are doing in the classroom at the time. And then lastly, posted or evidenced and meets the definition. So it meets the definition of assessment criteria and meets the definition of the learning target. So this concludes our video on teacher clarity, including the first three questions on the walkthrough document. If you have any questions, feel free to reach out to me. You can email me or stop by. And always, if you get feedback on your walkthrough that you have questions about, please contact your observer, because the feedback process needs to be reciprocal. Thank you very much.